Welcome to the channel Mirelle Tales. Before we start, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Now, let's get into today's story.
2 days after my wedding, my mother-in-law fired the housekeeper. She can go. From now on, my daughter-in-law will do her work. I immediately went back to my parents' house. The next day, 2 FBI cars pulled up and detained the entire family. On the morning of the second day after the wedding, I still hadn't gotten used to the feeling of being a married woman when, from the kitchen, a voice as sharp as a razor blade grated on my nerves. I had just pulled on a pair of jeans and a sweater. The wedding dress still smelled of fabric softener. I was about to go downstairs to help clean up when I heard my mother-in-law's every word. "Maria can go. From now on, with my daughter-in-law here, why do we need to hire an outsider?" I froze halfway down the stairs. The sensation was strange, as if a bucket of ice water had been dumped over my head. Yesterday, it had been sweet words holding hands in front of relatives. Phrases like, "This house has gained a daughter." And yet in just one night her tone had changed completely. There wasn't a hint of affection, much less anything resembling a mother's voice speaking to her newly married daughter-in-law. I descended slowly and saw Maria clutching an old cloth bag huddled in a corner, her face pale and her eyes red as if she had been scolded for a long time. At the dining table, my mother-in-law tossed an apron down with a sharp thud and lifted her chin in my direction with the air of someone giving orders to a new servant. She said this in front of my father-in-law, my husband, and my sister-in-law. "This house doesn't support a daughter-in-law who only knows about makeup. You're married now. You have to know how to serve your husband's family, not come here and sit like a piece of furniture." Before I could say anything, she started assigning me chores as if everything had already been planned. She recited each task, each schedule, in a monotonous, icy voice. "Starting tomorrow, Eleanor, you'll get up at 6 to make breakfast. Then you'll clean the house. In the afternoon, you'll do the laundry and ironing. In the evening, you'll cook to welcome relatives. We have visitors constantly. If you're a daughter-in-law and don't know your duties, don't complain." After saying this, she let out a scornful smile, her lips curved with malice. A girl from a good family has to know how to work, not sit around, waiting to be served. What chilled me wasn't just my mother-in-law's attitude, but Daniel's reaction. He was sitting next to me, but from the beginning he hadn't defended me once. I turned to my husband, hoping he would say at least one word of reason. But he just averted his gaze and replied in a voice as bland as water. "Mom's tone is a little harsh, but she just wants you to integrate into the house customs quickly." That sentence was enough for my heart to sink. It no longer seemed like a mere fit of anger. No, it was a well-rehearsed play. They probably waited for the exact moment the guests left and the ceremonies ended. The moment I set foot in that house as a daughter-in-law, they tore off all their masks. I took a deep breath and asked very slowly and clearly, "So in this house, am I the daughter-in-law or the replacement housekeeper?" My mother-in-law heard and smirked, the kind of smile that sends shivers down your spine. She put her hands on her hips, looked me up and down and answered, "Whatever. Is there a difference? A good daughter-in-law has to know how to do more than a housekeeper. You have a roof over your head, food on the table, and the reputation of being the daughter-in-law of a good family. What more do you want?" The room fell silent for a few seconds. Not out of shock, but because everyone knew that statement was excessive. But strangely, no one in that house felt the need to intervene. My father-in-law drank his coffee, his face impassive. Daniel stared at his phone, pretending not to hear. Sophie, next to her mother, arms crossed, was smiling. "Eleanor, don't be so dramatic. It's like this everywhere. We don't have daughters-in-law treated like queens here." I looked at her triumphant face and realized clearly that they were testing my limits. They wanted to see how much I could take, how far I would bend. They wanted to break me on the second day so that in the future I could never raise my head again. My mother-in-law approached and shoved the apron directly into my chest. The gesture was so abrupt that the apron's buckle scratched my hand. She said, articulating each word, "To the kitchen. In a little while, 12 of my husband's relatives are coming to meet the new daughter-in-law. See that you do things properly. Don't embarrass this family." I looked at the apron in my hands. It was no longer a simple piece of cloth. It was a humiliation. It was the brand she wanted to carve into a free servant for her entire family. I placed the apron on the table gently but firmly. I turned and went straight up to the bedroom. Behind me, I clearly heard my mother-in-law shouting, "Where are you going?" I didn't answer. I opened the closet and took out the small suitcase I hadn't had time to unpack since the wedding. I put in a few clothes, my wallet with my documents, my phone, and the charger. I took off the gold wedding earrings and carefully placed them in the suitcase. My movements were slow, but my heart was frozen. When I came down with the suitcase, the whole family stared at me. Only then did Daniel jump up alarmed and grab my arm. "Eleanor, what are you doing? Let's talk calmly." But his grip wasn't that of a husband afraid of hurting his wife. It was the grip of a man afraid of losing face in front of his family. I shook his hand off, looked him straight in the eye, and said concisely, "If this house needs a maid, I'm sorry, but I'm not taking the job." Hearing this, my mother-in-law became truly furious. She pointed to the door, her voice so shrill it hurt my ears. "If you walk out that door, don't even think about coming back." My house doesn't shelter an insolent daughter-in-law who dares to talk back to her mother-in-law 2 days after getting married. I turned and looked her directly in the face without looking away. It was probably the first time in her life she had encountered a daughter-in-law who dared to speak to her that way. I replied slowly, each word as clear as a nail. As a daughter-in-law, I might have considered it. As a maid for a family like this? No. With that, I picked up my suitcase and left. Behind me, I heard my mother-in-law's insults, my sister-in-law's whispers, and Daniel's voice calling out full of anger, but I didn't look back. I knew that if I did even once, they would think I was scared, and I couldn't let myself lose on the very first step. The next morning, while my host family was still stewing over my supposed insolence, 2 black sedans from the FBI pulled up in front of their gate. I was there too, standing next to Maria and an agent. As soon as the gate opened and the search warrant was read, I saw my mother-in-law's face turn pale, her lips trembling, unable to make a sound. Only then did she realize that the woman she had fired the day before was not just a housekeeper, and that I hadn't left out of weakness or a tantrum. I left that house because I already knew too much. Seeing the 2 FBI cars in front of my in-laws' house, Amelia's pale face and Daniel's panicked look, my mind inexplicably traveled back in time. They say it's only when a facade crumbles that we remember the small details of the past and realize the signs were there all along. It was the same for me in the midst of that tense morning. I remembered the day I met Daniel. I remembered how I believed, how I opened my heart, and entered this marriage with genuine sincerity. My name is Eleanor Hayes. I work in the legal department of a consumer goods distribution company. My family isn't rich, nor do I have great connections, but since I was little, my mother taught me something very important. Live in a way that no one can point a finger at you and accuse you of being dishonest. Maybe that's why I'm a very direct person. What's right I say is right. What I'm not sure about I don't promise in vain. I always thought that if I lived with dignity and worked seriously, my life, even if not brilliant, would be peaceful. I met Daniel at a business meeting about a supply contract between our companies. My first impression was of a man who spoke with moderation. He dressed neatly, wasn't loud, nor did he show off with money or contacts unlike many I'd met. During our conversation, he didn't interrupt me, didn't rush to show superiority, and even said very sensible things like, "The part your department needs to review, please do so rigorously. A long-term collaboration must be clear from the start." That sentence alone made me feel a connection with him. After that, he took the initiative to contact me again. At first, it was to ask for a few more details about the process. Then it turned into friendly, casual messages, just the right amount, without being excessive. I'm not the type of woman who melts easily with sweet words, but I have to admit that Daniel knew how to make others feel comfortable. He didn't pressure me, didn't paint rosy futures, just discreetly appeared at the right moment. On the days I worked late, he'd bring me a coffee. On the days I was so busy I didn't have dinner, he'd send a perfectly timed message. "When you finish, let me know. I'll take you for something warm to recharge." Little by little, I opened my heart. The more I got to know him, the more he seemed like the kind of man a woman like me with years of professional experience would easily trust. Daniel used to say things that gave a sense of security. Once, he looked at me very sincerely and said, "I don't need my wife to be an expert in household chores. I just need someone who is sincere, who knows how to respect, and who isn't calculating with her husband." A man who says something like that sincerely easily disarms a woman. Because hearing a lot of compliments isn't difficult, but hearing a sentence that doesn't burden a woman with the obligation to serve is different. When our relationship matured, he took me to meet his family. That day, I met Amelia for the first time. Judging by her appearance, no one would say she was the same woman who would later shove an apron into my chest. She was elegantly dressed and spoke sweetly. As soon as I entered, she took my hand and sat me down next to her. In an intimate tone, she said, "My dear, make yourself comfortable. I just want you to be good to my Daniel. Otherwise, we're not demanding in this house." The way she smiled, how she put food on my plate, and even how she turned to her husband and said, The girl has such a blessed air, made me think that maybe I was really lucky. My father-in-law, Mr. Arthur, was quieter. He wasn't overly warm, but he wasn't coldly unpleasant either. He sat observing, asking one or two questions about my work, my family, my lifestyle. His gaze made me feel like I was being thoroughly evaluated, but at the time I thought it was normal. It's natural for parents to want to know their future daughter-in-law well. Maria was already working in the house. My impression of her was of a thin, quiet woman who moved very discreetly. Whenever Amelia called her, even if it was just to bring another pot of coffee or a plate of fruit, she would startle visibly. I noticed this but justified it to myself that having worked there for many years, maybe she was afraid of her employers. It's common for housekeepers to be reserved. Little did I know that some downcast looks are not out of shyness, but because they have seen too many things they dare not talk about. After a few visits, my future mother-in-law started insisting on the idea of us all living together after the wedding. She spoke very cleverly, and at first glance it seemed perfectly reasonable. Newlyweds, living alone is so lonely. Stay here for a while so the house has more life, so you can learn the family's ways. We'll see later. Daniel also agreed with his mother, but without pressuring me, he would say softly, "My mom is a bit demanding, but if you live near her, you'll see she has a good heart. And for you who works all day, it's better to come home and have family around." It was because of that tone that I fell for it. Before the wedding, his family organized everything in grand style. The cars for transportation were impeccable. The party was not modest, and all the relatives who appeared were friendly and well-spoken. Amelia even introduced me to everyone with a tone of pride. "My daughter-in-law is educated, she knows how to converse, you can tell she has a good upbringing." Hearing those words, anyone from the outside could only praise my luck. And I myself at the time thought the same. I believed I was about to enter a family that was respectable on the outside, and probably not bad on the inside. However, recalling it now, I realized there was something very strange. The closer it got to the wedding day, whenever the conversation touched on my work, the look in all three of their eyes changed. My father-in-law would ask me in detail what kind of documents I handled, if I frequently dealt with contracts, if I knew the legal processes of companies. My mother-in-law would interrupt with seemingly innocent phrases. "A girl so smart must read documents very quickly, right, Daniel?" Also several times said half jokingly, half seriously, "With your marriage, our family can rest much easier when it comes to paperwork." At the time, I would smile and let it pass. I thought it was simple curiosity about the daughter-in-law's profession. Little did I know that this interest was part of the calculated plan they had for me from the beginning, and I entered that marriage with a very simple belief. I thought I had found a decent husband, that I was entering a family with rules but not malevolent, that it was enough for me to be sincere and correct to be treated with decency sooner or later. I believed it. I really believed it. And maybe because I believed so much, when the veneer started to crack, I realized that underneath there weren't just a few fissures as I had thought, but an entire house rotten to the core. The more I remember, the more I see that what happened on the morning of the second day after the wedding wasn't such a sudden turn of events. It was just the most visible result of many signs that had already appeared, discreetly small but poisonous. And the more I think, the more it gives me chills. When we were still dating and preparing for the wedding, I reassured myself several times, thinking maybe I was being too sensitive. But looking back, I understand that a woman's intuition rarely fails without reason. After a few visits to Daniel's house, I began to notice that his mother had a very peculiar way of speaking. She didn't scold directly, or show her displeasure, obviously. She usually chose to say things in a joking tone as if she were testing me, but every sentence had a thorn. Once we were having dinner with some relatives from his father's side, and she turned to me smiling and asked, "A girl with so much education surely doesn't know how to cook a roast or pick out vegetables, right?" The whole table laughed as if it were a harmless joke. I also smiled awkwardly, but inside I felt a jolt. A person I barely knew and who was about to be my mother-in-law should be creating a sense of closeness, but instead she chose to test me in front of everyone. On another occasion, I was talking to Daniel about how after the wedding, I wanted to continue working normally. It was something he knew from the beginning, and always said he supported. However, as soon as I mentioned work, Amelia, who was peeling fruit nearby, intervened immediately. Women distinguish themselves in the kitchen not by their diplomas. The atmosphere became heavy. Her sentence wasn't said loudly or aggressively, but it was like a needle poking directly where a person feels most secure. Before I could react, Daniel laughed to cover it up and squeezed my hand under the table. "Mom's just saying that. Don't think too much about it." It was precisely the way he always chose to appease, instead of distinguishing right from wrong, that made me ignore the situation several times. Now thinking about it, maybe he wasn't blind. He saw everything very well. He just didn't want me to confront the problem. Sophie, Daniel's sister, was completely different from her mother. If my mother-in-law was malicious in a subtle, sweet on the outside way, Sophie was openly acidic. She used to look at me with a mixture of scrutiny and sarcasm and then say phrases that seemed innocent but were full of malice. One day, she asked in front of her brother, "You work so much. Who's going to take care of my brother then?" Another day, she added, "A married woman who is still so obsessed with work ends up destroying her family." I would listen and smile diplomatically, but inside I began to feel uncomfortable. I wasn't even a daughter-in-law of that house yet, and both the mother and the daughter were already pressuring me on the exact same point: my work, my independence, and my habit of living with principles. The more I frequented the house, the more I felt a strange atmosphere. They talked a lot about rules, family tradition, respect for elders. But the person who suffered the most in that house was Maria, the housekeeper, who had worked there for many years. She moved without making a sound, spoke very little, always walked with her head down as if even breathing too deeply could irritate someone. Once I saw her carrying a tray of coffee to the living room. She was just a few seconds late because her hands were wet, and my mother-in-law growled, "We don't feed useless people here." Maria immediately flinched, her lips trembling, and hurried to put the tray down, apologizing repeatedly. Seeing that scene, I felt very bad. A truly decent family doesn't treat its employees like that. Then there was something I never forgot. One day, I passed by my father-in-law's office. The door wasn't completely closed, leaving a crack just wide enough to see inside. I glanced in and saw several boxes of files stacked up, some company stamps on the desk, and in a corner packages of nutritional products without labels. Before I could process what I was seeing, Mr. Arthur came out of the office and quickly closed the door. He stared at me for a few seconds and then smiled dismissively. "It's business stuff. Women don't need to worry about it." The way he reacted so quickly, so secretly, and still tried to dismiss the matter with a derogatory phrase left a bug in my ear. But what struck me the most came from Maria. One afternoon, as I was crossing from the backyard to the kitchen, she passed by me, her eyes as always downcast. But her mouth moved to say something very low. So low that if I hadn't been close, I wouldn't have heard. "Don't sign anything without reading it very carefully." I started and turned to ask her what she had said, but she had already moved away as if she had never opened her mouth. The sentence was so out of place that it became memorable. I stood there for a few seconds, mentally repeating those words. Asterisk. Don't sign anything. Asterisk. Why would she warn me? A long-time housekeeper, as discreet as a shadow. Why would she risk telling me that in the days before the wedding, my suspicion became clearer? My mother-in-law called me to the living room, handed me a stack of papers, and said they were documents for residency registration and other post-wedding procedures to make things easier. She spoke very quickly, insisting that I sign right away because she was busy with wedding preparations and didn't have time for explanations. I took the papers, and as I flipped through them, I saw that some forms didn't look like residency documents. There were pages with very generic titles and others with vague content without specifying the scope of the declaration. I closed the folder, smiled, and handed it back to her. "I'll take these home to read carefully, and then I'll sign." I remember that moment perfectly. The smile on Amelia's face vanished almost instantly. It was only for a fraction of a second, but I saw it clearly. It wasn't the expression of disappointment at a refusal, but of irritation that something she thought would be easy had been blocked midway. But she recovered her composure very quickly and said in a light voice, "Of course you're right to be careful." That night, I happened to pass by the end of the hallway and heard my mother-in-law talking to Daniel. Her voice was very low, but the irritation was clear. "This girl works with papers. She's very suspicious. We have to choose the moment when she trusts us the most." I stopped, petrified. Before I could hear more, they fell silent. They must have heard my footsteps. When I appeared, Daniel turned quickly, hugged me, and smiled as if nothing was wrong, saying his mom was just stressed about the wedding, and that's why she was talking a little strangely. I smiled too, but from that moment on, I started to feel a knot in my stomach, hard to define. It wasn't enough to make me call off the wedding, nor to confront them, but it was enough to make me more alert, to make me understand that this family was not as simple as it seemed. And the closer to the wedding, the clearer that feeling became. They didn't just want me to be a daughter-in-law. They wanted me to enter their gear of control, to obey without question, without suspicion, without staying on the sidelines. What I vaguely felt before the wedding, after it ceased to be a premonition, it began to manifest in actions, words, complicit glances exchanged between them. And the more I saw, the more I understood that the facade of tradition and respect was just a veneer. Underneath, there was control calculation, and a secret that the whole family was trying to hide at all costs. The wedding had barely ended. The guests hadn't all left yet. I was saying goodbye to the last ones when my mother-in-law sat in the middle of the living room and gathered all the envelopes, gold, and valuable gifts in front of her. She opened each bag, counted each stack of bills, organized each jewelry box while saying as if it were the most natural thing in the world, "Mom will keep this to be safer." Young people with so much money can do foolish things. Before I could react, Daniel intervened with a light voice. "Let Mom keep it, we'll see later." That later sounded simple, but I didn't like it. The money and wedding gifts were our business, the couple's. If we had to decide something, it would be a clear conversation, not an appropriation followed by a warning. I looked at the pile of envelopes on the table at my mother-in-law's hands, going through each item with excessive familiarity, and I felt a certain discomfort. But since the wedding had just happened, and there were still guests, I didn't want to create tension, and kept quiet. Now thinking about it, that was the first time they tested how easily I could be pressured. That night, which should have been our first night as a married couple, a moment when the couple should rest after an exhausting day almost at 11 p.m. There was a knock on our bedroom door. I opened it and saw my mother-in-law, still with clips in her hair, speaking in a voice that wasn't loud but was authoritarian. "Tomorrow morning, get up early. The relatives are still here. You have to come down to greet them, make the coffee, serve the water properly. A new daughter-in-law who sleeps in people will say this house didn't know how to teach you." She stood there at the door, giving a few more instructions, all of them petty and irritating. I should speak softly, not fill the coffee cups too much. Bow slightly to the elders, smile at everyone. I felt uncomfortable, but I told myself that every house had its rules. I was new there. I had to put up with it for a few days and see how things went. At the time, I didn't know that the rules of that house were in fact a tool to teach others to bow before them. The next morning, as soon as I came down, I was immediately sent to the kitchen to help Maria prepare breakfast for the guests. Before I had a sip of water, my mother-in-law was already by my side, pointing to one task after another. She analyzed my every little move as if waiting for a slip-up to criticize me. "I cut the vegetables a little too thick," she complained. "I served the coffee almost to the brim of the cup." She frowned. "I put the bowl in the wrong place," she grumbled. "I married you to be a daughter-in-law, not to have a little princess to admire." The sentence made me blush, not out of shame for the work, but for the way she deliberately demeaned me in front of the housekeeper and relatives. What irritated me even more was that Daniel saw everything. He walked around the house, heard every word from his mother, saw how I was being scrutinized, and still didn't intervene. At one point, he passed through the kitchen and whispered in my ear, "Just put up with it for a few more days to make Mom happy." I turned to him and felt a chill. A husband who truly loved his wife, even if he didn't dare to contradict his mother, would at least make his wife feel that he understood her suffering. Instead, he chose to stay on the sidelines as if my suffering were something I should accept. Around noon, as the guests started to leave, my father-in-law called me into the living room. He was already sitting in the armchair with a thick folder in front of him. His voice was calm, seeming normal at first glance. "Eleanor, look over these papers for me, please. They're just some internal declarations. Sign them to get it over with. Since you have knowledge in the area, it's safer for a family member to handle this." I took the papers, and as soon as I flipped through the first pages, I felt that something was wrong. They weren't unimportant declarations, as he said. There was content related to corporate entities' distribution of goods and liability for product circulation. Reading that, I stopped, immediately raised my head, and keeping my voice calm, said, "I can't sign company documents without reading them carefully, and much less sign them on the spot." As soon as I finished the sentence, the expression on my father-in-law's and mother-in-law's faces changed. Mr. Arthur put his coffee cup on the table, with more force than usual. Amelia smiled dismissively, a smile that the more you looked at, the more venomous it seemed. "You've barely arrived in this house, and you're already being as calculating as a stranger." Hearing that, I realized I had touched a point they didn't want me to refuse. I returned the folder without saying anything else, but from that moment, a very clear feeling began to grow inside me. They weren't just curious about my profession. They wanted to use me for something related to documents. And that something wasn't clean, to the point that they had chosen the moment right after my wedding to present it to me. That night, things went further than I had imagined. As I passed by the backyard, I heard a dragging sound and stopped. Peeking around the corner of the wall, I saw my mother-in-law grabbing Maria's wrist tightly, almost dragging her into the storage shed. Her voice hissed between her teeth without any trace of her usual composure. "What did you tell her? Tell me the truth." Maria was trembling, babbling incomprehensible words. My father-in-law stood by, not intervening, not saying anything, just watching coldly as if it were perfectly normal. I took a step forward and called out softly, "What's going on?" In an instant, the attitude of all three changed. My mother-in-law quickly let go of her hand, and turning adjusted her voice as if nothing had happened. Nothing. She was clumsy and broke some things, but I clearly saw that Maria's wrist was purple with red marks on the skin. She didn't dare to look at me, just lowered her head, her lips pressed together. A normal housekeeper wouldn't be controlled that way over a few unimportant words. At that moment, my suspicion was no longer vague. This house had a secret, and Maria knew what it was. Night fell, and I went up to the bedroom with a heavy heart. I opened my suitcase to get my phone charger and stopped. One of the zippers was crooked. The documents inside were no longer in the same position I had arranged them. I'm very organized. I know immediately if someone has been through my things. I looked up and saw Daniel at the door, his hand still on the knob as if he were about to enter. He looked at me and quickly changed the subject. "I thought you might need something. Came to check." The excuse was so forced that I didn't press it, but in my head, everything started to make sense. The folder of documents from the afternoon, Maria being interrogated, my suitcase being rummaged through, it all pointed in the same direction. They didn't just want me to live by their rules. They wanted to control everything that belonged to me, from my reactions and habits to my personal documents. I entered that house with a wedding dress and confidence, but after little more than a day, I already saw a completely different atmosphere. From the facade of decency, tense false, full of secrets, and especially very afraid that I knew too much. At the time, I didn't imagine that everything I had seen was just the prelude. The most painful, most humiliating slap was waiting for me on the morning of my second day as a daughter-in-law. On the morning of the second day after the wedding, I woke up when the yard was still covered in dew. Inside the house, the clatter of dishes could be heard from very early. The relatives from his father's side were coming that day to meet the new daughter-in-law. It seems like a simple thing, but anyone who has ever been a daughter-in-law knows it's a very clear test. People don't just come to see your face. They come to see how you behave, how you speak, how you work, and then they silently evaluate whether you are competent or not. I went down the stairs. The smell of oil, food, and smoke from the kitchen hung in the air. In the kitchen, Maria was alone, struggling with several large pots, her hair hastily tied up, her face pale with dark circles from lack of sleep, showing she had been woken up very early. My mother-in-law paced back and forth, now in the kitchen, now in the living room, glancing at the stairs from time to time as if waiting for the right moment for my appearance. Her agitation didn't seem like that of someone busy receiving guests, but rather that of someone preparing a pre-planned act. Before I could even say, "Good morning," Amelia turned abruptly and called out in a loud voice, "Maria, come here." Her voice echoed through the house so loud and sharp that even the people setting the tables in the living room looked up. Maria, startled, wiped her hands on her apron and approached, walking so cautiously as if she were afraid of making a sound. My mother-in-law didn't beat around the bush. She took a wad of cash from her robe pocket, threw it on the glass table with a crack, and said coldly, "This is your salary for this month. You can go. From now on, this house doesn't need outsiders." Maria was in shock, her face pale. My heart skipped a beat, but I still didn't want to believe she would dare to say what was clearly in her eyes. And she did. She turned to me, smirked, and raising her voice on purpose so the whole house could hear, declared, "My daughter-in-law is young, strong, and educated. Doing these chores won't kill her. If she's here, why spend money on housekeepers?" The sentence fell in the middle of the living room like a slap. It was no longer hints or tests. It was a public humiliation. It was the declaration that from that moment on, in her eyes, I was not the daughter-in-law, but the free replacement for a housekeeper who had just been fired. I turned to Daniel. It was the last moment I expected a husband's reaction from him. Just one sentence, a single sentence of minimal decency like, "Mom, don't talk like that," would have been enough for me to know I hadn't been completely wrong. But he just sat there, his face tense, his hands clasped as if he were calculating something. Only a few seconds later did he speak in a voice so monotonous it chilled me. "Staying home for a while is good. Your job out there can wait." I heard that and felt a shiver from my neck to my spine. So it wasn't just my mother-in-law picking on me. This had been arranged. They didn't just want me in the kitchen. They wanted to take me away from my work, my life, from everything that allowed me to maintain my lucidity. They wanted me trapped in that house, obeying, getting used to serving, and when necessary, signing whatever they gave me. I looked directly at my mother-in-law and asked very slowly, "Why does Maria have to leave right now?" Amelia laughed, a sharp, venomous laugh like a thin blade. "Because this house doesn't support two maids. Then she pointed her finger directly at my face, each word loaded with contempt. Either you learn to be a decent daughter-in-law or you get out of here. Just that sentence made my last limit break. I stood there looking at this house where I had been married for only 2 days, and which already reeked of authoritarianism and lies. At that precise moment, while everyone was focused on me and my mother-in-law, Maria bent down to pick up a napkin that had fallen next to my small suitcase which I had left near the stairs the day before. As she stood up, she leaned in slightly, and with a trembling but extremely fast hand slipped a small, hard object into the side pocket of the suitcase. Before I could see what it was, she whispered almost like a breath of wind passing my ear, "Leave, don't stay. Inside is what they're most afraid of." I was petrified for a second, but that second was enough. All the loose pieces in my head clicked into place. Maria, being interrogated, the folders of vague documents, my rummaged suitcase, my father-in-law's look whenever papers were mentioned. Daniel's calculated silence. Firing Maria today wasn't about saving money or having a new daughter-in-law. They were silencing someone who knew too much. And keeping me there, forcing me to quit my job, turning me into a free servant, it wasn't just to boss me around. They wanted to break me, to make me obedient, dependent, easy to control, so that when the time came, they could use my clean name to sign, to take the blame, to pay for their crimes. Perhaps my mother-in-law, seeing me stand still for so long, thought I was starting to get scared. Immediately, she shouted louder, her shrill voice tearing through the room. "I bet at your house they taught you to be a daughter who only knows how to eat and sit around. That's why you come here and have no manners." I could take it for myself. I had put up with it since the wedding day. But bringing my parents into it, no. No one has the right to drag the people who raised me through the mud, just because I refuse to be the maid of their house. I dragged my suitcase into the middle of the house. The sound of the wheels on the tile floor was sharp and hard. I took the wedding ring off my finger and placed it on the glass table in front of the whole family. The sound of the ring hitting the table was very low, but the room fell into absolute silence. I looked directly at my mother-in-law and then at Daniel, and said word for word without rushing. "A daughter-in-law needs to be respected. A maid needs to be paid. This family wants to exploit and humiliate at the same time. I'm not for it." The family was in shock. Probably no one expected a daughter-in-law married for 2 days to dare to speak like that in broad daylight just before the relatives arrived. My mother-in-law opened her mouth and then growled as if she were about to explode with rage. "You dare!" I didn't answer her anymore. I picked up my suitcase and went straight for the gate. Only then did Daniel run after me, but not to apologize or to hold me back with affection. He grabbed my elbow, his voice low and threatening. "If you leave now, you'll create a scandal." I turned to him. Just 2 days ago, I thought this man was my safe harbor, but at that moment looking into his eyes, I only saw calculation and anger that his plan had been ruined. I answered him concisely. "No, the scandal is your family, and you're about to not be able to hide it anymore." I shook his arm off and walked out the gate without looking back. Arriving at my mother's house, I locked the bedroom door and sat on the edge of the bed. My hands were shaking, but my mind was strangely lucid. I opened the side pocket of the suitcase and took out the object Maria had given me. It was a small black USB drive. I plugged it into my computer and sat motionless in front of the screen. Inside were videos of the repackaging of nutritional products of unknown origin, photographs of double-entry bookkeeping, scanned files of certificates with my father-in-law's signature, and contracts where the legal liability was deliberately being transferred to someone else. I went through each file with a shiver down my spine. After all, I wasn't imagining things. This marriage from the beginning was not clean. I sat there paralyzed for a long time. Then I picked up my phone and called my Uncle Mike. The moment I heard his voice on the other end, I realized one very clear thing. This marriage had ended the instant my mother-in-law threw the money on the table, and my counterattack was just beginning. I sat in front of the computer screen until almost midnight, my eyes fixed on the videos, the scanned files, and the spreadsheets Maria had left on that small USB drive. The more I saw, the colder my hands became. What I had suspected for some time was even darker than I had imagined. It wasn't just about some vague documents or furtive behavior. My husband's family was operating a whole network of label swapping, legitimizing low-quality nutritional products, maintaining double-entry bookkeeping, and preparing an escape route to transfer legal responsibility to someone else if something went wrong. I opened each folder and each layer of data revealed itself to be frighteningly clear. There were videos showing goods being transferred from packages of unknown origin to clean, shiny boxes. There were photographs from the warehouse of inbound and outbound invoices, with discrepancies in quantities. There were even carefully scanned contracts, but the section for the person legally responsible for distribution was blank. I stared at that space and felt a chill down my spine. That was exactly where they had tried several times to force me to sign. One moment my father-in-law said it was an internal declaration. The next, my mother-in-law said it was just a family procedure. Then Daniel would evasively say that since we were family, it was safer to sign. After all, from the beginning, they didn't need me as a daughter-in-law. They needed a clean name, a person with training, with education, without scandals, presentable enough to take the blame for the whole family. I sat motionless for a long time, and then I laughed. A dry laugh. It wasn't a laugh of joy, but of bitterness. Just 2 days ago, I was wearing a wedding dress, believing I was building a home. But now, looking at the blank spaces, waiting for a signature on those documents, I realized that the place they had prepared for me from the beginning was not in the family, but on the defendant's stand. I didn't scream, I didn't cry, nor did I go to their house to make a scene like an out-of-control woman. My mother outside the room looked at me worriedly, but I just told her to let me call my Uncle Mike. Uncle Mike is my mother's brother and has worked in the FBI for many years. I knew that if I called him crying, he would ignore it. So when he answered, I kept my voice slow and clear. Uncle, I'm not asking for a personal favor. I have evidence, but I need to follow the correct procedure. The line was silent for a few seconds. I heard his breath. Then he said concisely, his voice deeper. If you're sure you can't make a single misstep, open the computer and send me an index of the files first. That sentence alone was enough for me to know he understood the gravity of the situation. Almost an hour later, he arrived at my house. He wasn't wearing a uniform. He didn't come in an official car. He just brought an old briefcase and a serious expression. He didn't ask me how I had been treated or why 2 days after getting married I had come home with a suitcase. He sat next to me, put on his glasses, and said, "Open each file." I obeyed. We both analyzed each video, each photograph, each contract, each data table. The more we saw, the more serious his expression became. When he saw the scans with the blank space in the section, for the person legally responsible for distribution, he placed his hand on the table, tapped his fingers twice, and asked, "Have they already given you this to sign?" I nodded. He looked at me intently. "If you had signed, you would have been lost." The sentence wasn't said loudly, but it hit me hard. I looked at the screen, my voice hoarse. They didn't need a daughter-in-law. They needed a clean name to blame. Uncle Mike didn't answer immediately. He was silent for a few seconds, and then said, "Remember one thing. From now on, you can't contact them emotionally. Don't challenge them, don't provoke them, don't let them guess what you have. But life doesn't always allow us to remain calm." Around midnight, my phone started ringing incessantly. It was Amelia, then Sophie, and even their home number one call after another, as if they were desperate about something. I looked at the glowing screen and felt a coldness inside. Innocent people don't panic like that. I didn't answer. I let the phone ring. After the 10th call, I sent just one message. "Don't call me anymore. I already know everything." The message was sent, and less than 5 minutes later, Daniel called. I saw his name on the screen and felt nothing anymore. Just the certainty that I needed to hear what he would say when his mask of decency fell. I answered. Before I could say anything, his voice, no longer soft as usual, came from the other side. "What the hell are you doing? What USB drive is this? Where did you get it?" I smiled bitterly. Even now, he didn't ask if I was okay or how I had gotten home. The first thing that worried him was the USB drive. I answered him directly, each word as sharp as a knife. "You'd better ask your mother what she's more afraid of, me or the law." On the other end, silence for a few seconds. I heard him grit his teeth before lowering his tone, his voice deep and cold. "Don't cross the line. You don't know my family." I leaned back in my chair, my eyes still on the computer screen, my voice so calm that even I was surprised. "I've figured it out. I've figured out enough not to be a maid again, and also not to be your scapegoat." Daniel didn't answer immediately. His heavy breathing on the other end of the line. Finally, he said a sentence that made me understand much more. "If you do this, you'll have no way back." I smiled slightly. "The one with no way back isn't me." And I hung up. Uncle Mike, sitting in front of me, looked at me. He didn't scold me, nor did he praise me. He just said, "From now on, you have to put aside your perspective as a wife. Don't think of him as your husband. Think of him as a link in this case." I heard him and felt a lump in my throat, not because I still missed him, but because of the pain of knowing that there are truths that once seen do not allow us to be naive again. The next morning, I accompanied Uncle Mike to a federal building to file the initial complaint. Following the correct procedure, I didn't make a scene, didn't cry in the middle of the room telling my story, nor did I use my personal situation to ask for favors. I just sat down, opened my laptop, and handed over all the original data, the file index, the creation dates, the storage origin, all intact without edits. The agent who took my statement examined everything for a long time, asked some necessary questions, and filed a clear report. From that moment, I knew the case had entered a new phase. It was no longer a conflict between a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law. It was a matter of the law. Before we left, Uncle Mike stopped on the steps, looked at me for a long time, and said slowly, "From now on, you're no longer an involved party. You are the person who provided the evidence. Don't let your feelings lead you astray." I nodded, but I still had an unanswered question. Where did Daniel fit into all this? Was he a victim dragged along by the family, or did he know everything from the beginning and was just playing the role of a good husband? I left the building. The sky was clear. The sun had already risen, but I felt a coldness inside. I knew that once the complaint was accepted, things couldn't stop at a simple family argument. And I also knew better than anyone that my husband's family would not leave me alone. They wouldn't sit back and watch a daughter-in-law married for 2 days destroy the plan they had been building for so long. But this time, I wasn't going to run away. I had left their house, but I wasn't going to give up. I waited. I knew they would act first. And I also wanted to see, when cornered, to what extent each member of that family would reveal their true face. I thought that after the complaint was filed, my husband's family would be a little apprehensive, that they would at least retreat temporarily to try to figure out what I had. But I was wrong. In just one night, their attitude changed completely. No more insistent calls with false apologies. No more soft tones from someone who wanted me to come back to cover up the matter. They chose another path, faster, crueler, and more in line with their true nature. Pressure, slander, crush me first so I would get scared and back down. That morning, my mother was in the kitchen when the landline rang. I had barely reached the door when I heard Amelia's shrill voice. On the other end of the line, even without the speakerphone, you could hear everything. "What kind of upbringing did you give your daughter that 2 days after getting married, she comes to destroy her husband's family? What kind of daughter-in-law is that?" Her voice no longer had its composure. It was acidic, furious, and full of the habit of crushing others. My mother is not an aggressive person, but she has never been weak. She put the knife on the cutting board, wiped her hands on her apron, and picked up the phone, her voice very calm. "My daughter didn't destroy anyone. She just refused to do what is wrong." On the other end, silence for a few seconds. Then Amelia laughed dismissively. The kind of laugh that just hearing it you feel the venom. "We'll see how long she lasts." With that, she hung up abruptly. The kitchen fell silent. My mother turned to me. She didn't ask many questions, just said very softly, "They've started to show their true colors." In the afternoon, Daniel showed up at my door. He didn't call beforehand, nor did he enter with the posture of a husband coming to get his wife. His clothes were still impeccable, his hair styled, but his face was different. It no longer had the gentle, soft expression I had believed in. On his face was only the tension of someone who is cornered and has to protect his family's interests at all costs. As soon as he saw me on the porch, he said directly, without beating around the bush, "Let's be direct. Delete all the data and I'll pretend nothing happened." I looked at him and felt a strange emptiness. There are moments when the pain is so great that we stop feeling it. I went down one step and asked him just one question, slow and clear. "If I had signed those papers and tomorrow there were problems, would you have taken the blame for me?" Daniel stood motionless. The afternoon wind blew through the hedge, making the dry leaves whisper. He didn't say a single word. His silence was the clearest answer. He had no intention of saving me. From the beginning, the plan was for me to take the fall. I took the wedding ring from my pocket, which I hadn't had a chance to return to him, and placed it in his hand. The ring was ice cold in my palm. My voice wasn't loud, but each word was firm and sharp. "You don't need a wife. You need someone to sign for you." Daniel clenched the ring so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He clenched his jaw, his eyes darkened. A moment later he growled, "Don't make me go further." I looked him straight in the eyes. "The ones who forced me from the beginning were you and your family." He stood there for a few more seconds as if he wanted to say something but gave up. He turned his back and left his steps heavy and hurried. I watched him walk away and no longer felt any kind of nostalgia. A man who goes to his wife's house and the first thing he says is not an apology, not an explanation, but a condition to delete evidence from that moment on. He is just part of the case. He is no longer my husband. I thought I had seen the worst, but that night they showed me they could be even lower. A friend from work sent me some screenshots from some local social media groups. I opened the images, and my hands turned cold. My wedding photo had been shared. My name was mentioned, my workplace disclosed. Accompanying it were disgusting lies that I was living off my husband's family. And when I couldn't get more money, I started slandering them. That as soon as I got married, I ran away from home to play the victim. There were even comments insinuating that because I worked in the legal field, I had made everything up to blackmail them. I looked at each of those words and felt a lump in my throat, not out of fear of what people might say, but because I realized this was just the beginning. They wanted to turn me from a provider of evidence into a suspect in the public eye. Less than 10 minutes later, Sophie sent me a message. Just one line, but enough to show her true face. "You think you've won? A newly married daughter-in-law. How are you going to fight against an entire family?" I looked at the message for a long time and replied with just one sentence. "I'm not fighting against you. I'm letting the law do its job." I knew that people like Sophie love to see others lose their minds to argue so they can manipulate and distort things, but this time, I didn't give them what they wanted. Later that night, Uncle Mike called me. His voice was more serious than usual. "They've started to react. Once they get to the point of slandering and forcing you to delete data, it's very likely they'll try to destroy the remaining evidence. You have to be prepared." I sat on the edge of the bed clutching my phone. "And if they do that?" My uncle replied dryly, "The faster they act, the faster they fall. But the danger is that when people are desperate, they can do crazy things." His sentence sent a chill down my spine, and at that moment I realized something even more frightening than being slandered or threatened. They didn't just want to destroy me. They wanted to silence the living source of evidence that was still inside that house. And that person was Maria. Around midnight, when the whole house was already dark, my phone rang from an unknown number. As soon as I answered, I heard Maria's breathless, trembling voice. Just from hearing it, I knew something was wrong. She spoke in broken sentences. The fear was so great she could barely articulate the words. "Miss Eleanor, they've locked me up. They said if I open my mouth." The sentence didn't finish. On the other end, I heard a loud noise as if something had fallen and the call was cut off. I jumped out of bed, my heart beating so fast it felt like it would come out of my chest. In those brief seconds, I realized that everything had escalated to another level. It was no longer a matter of a mother-in-law oppressing a daughter-in-law or a family trying to save face. They had started to use force to silence witnesses, to act desperately to save themselves. And when a family is willing to lock up a woman just for fear of what she might say, what they are hiding is certainly much darker than what I saw on that USB drive. As soon as I hung up, I immediately called my Uncle Mike. My voice no longer had the calmness of previous times. I spoke quickly, almost without breathing. "Uncle, Maria just called. They've locked her up." The call was cut off in the middle. On the other end, silence for a few seconds. Then Uncle Mike asked short, direct questions. "Unknown number or the old one? Did you hear any other voice? Any strange noise?" I forced myself to remember every detail, from Maria's ragged breathing to the loud noise before the call dropped. The more I talked, the colder I felt inside. It was no longer suspicion or intuition. If a woman has to call for help in a state of panic like that, it's a clear sign of kidnapping and perhaps even an attempt to silence her at all costs. Uncle Mike told me to open all the data from the USB drive again, especially the audio files we hadn't had time to listen to carefully the night before. I sat at my desk, turned on the laptop, my hands shaking so much I had to click the mouse twice to get it right. A few minutes later, my uncle arrived. We both put on headphones and listened to each recording. Some were just sounds of footsteps, doors opening and closing, things being dragged in the storage shed. But on one of the last ones, both he and I stopped. In that recording, Maria's voice wasn't her usual submissive one. She was speaking very low, very fast, as if she were taking advantage of a moment to whisper to someone. "I've gathered almost everything. I just need the warehouse exit documents and the comparison of the lot numbers. I have to get them before they move things." On the other end, the voice of an unknown man, concise, "Don't expose yourself in any way. When you have enough evidence, let us know." The recording lasted a little over 30 seconds, but it was enough to leave me paralyzed. I turned to Uncle Mike. He was also looking at me, his gaze as heavy as a stone. He took off his headphones and said slowly, "This woman is not a simple housekeeper. It's very likely she was already an informant, maybe even a link in another investigation." Hearing that sent a shiver down my spine. It meant that in that house all this time it wasn't just me who felt unsafe. Someone had already noticed the irregularities long ago, and was secretly collecting every piece of evidence, every invoice, every box, every word, waiting for the day everything would come to light. I remembered Maria's gaze whenever she passed me. I remembered her trembling hand when she put the USB drive in my suitcase. I remembered the sentence that sounded like a whisper. Inside is what they're most afraid of. At the time, I thought she was afraid of retaliation and was taking a risk to save herself. Now I realized she wasn't just scared. She was betting her own life. A woman cornered to the point of accepting to be a housekeeper in that dangerous house for almost a year, lowering her head, living like a shadow just to gather evidence, means that what they were hiding was very serious. That same night, Uncle Mike contacted the authorities to report the emergency situation. But everything has to have a basis and a procedure. An interrupted distress call was not enough for immediate intervention, especially since the other side could claim it was a misunderstanding. To an outsider, it seems frustrating, but for someone in the field like my uncle, acting rashly and violating procedures could ruin everything, and even give them the opportunity to erase everything. Meanwhile, the most frightening thing was that Maria didn't have much time. I couldn't sit still. Every time I thought of her trapped in that house in the storage shed, where I had seen my mother-in-law interrogating her, I felt my chest tighten. I jumped up, grabbed my car keys. I'm going. Even if it's just to stand outside the gate, I have to see how she is. Uncle Mike blocked my path, his voice as serious as I had ever heard it. If you go now, you'll only mess everything up. You won't save anyone if you become the second hostage. I was paralyzed. The sentence was cold but true. I could take a risk out of anger, but if I went back and got trapped in that house, everything Maria had risked to give me would be in vain. At that moment, my phone vibrated continuously. It wasn't calls, but messages from Daniel. The first, don't get any more involved in this. The second, this isn't as simple as you think. The third, a few minutes later, shorter but heavier, if you keep insisting, no one will be able to save you. I looked at the screen glowing in the darkness and felt something strange run down my spine. For the first time in his words, there wasn't just threat or control, but also fear. A very real fear of someone who knows they are losing control of the situation. I replied with just one line. I know it's not simple. If it were, you wouldn't have to hide it. The message was sent, and on the other end, absolute silence. No more arguments, no more threats. And it was that silence that gave me more certainty than any confession. They were really in a panic. They were no longer in a position of power. They were starting to despair. Time passed heavily like lead. The clock's hands moved slowly. My mother sat in the living room, not daring to turn on the television. I sat at the table, clutching the USB drive as if it were a bomb about to explode. Around 3 a.m., Uncle Mike's phone rang. He went outside to answer, but I saw his expression change completely when he came back. He didn't sit down, just said very quickly, "There are signs they're moving merchandise urgently overnight. If they succeed, the physical evidence will disappear." Hearing that, I felt my blood run cold. So they had really acted. Not only did they lock up Maria to silence her, but they were also taking the opportunity to clear out the warehouse, divert the merchandise, and erase all traces. If that merchandise disappeared, and Maria remained a hostage, the USB drive in my hands, though valuable, could be discredited as a setup, a slander. I looked at Uncle Mike, my lips dry. "Are we still in time, Uncle?" he answered concisely. "We have to go." From that moment, the air in my house became unbreathable. Uncle Mike made several calls reporting the urgency of the situation, pushing to get an emergency search warrant due to the signs of evidence destruction and kidnapping. I didn't get involved. I just listened to the short, cold phrases of a professional. But it was that conciseness that made me realize the situation had reached a boiling point. One more misstep, and the warehouse could be empty, Maria could disappear, and that family would put on their mask of decency again, to deny everything. Near dawn, my uncle turned to me and said firmly, "Come with me." I didn't ask any more questions. I grabbed a jacket, put the USB drive in my pocket, and followed him to the car. It was dark outside. The cold wind seeped through the window cracks and made my hands numb. I sat in the car, clutching the USB drive so tightly it hurt. The streetlights passed by the window like long, blurry streaks. In my head, there was only one clear, intense thought pounding at my temples: either everything comes to light today, or they get away with it. The car turned the corner of the street, and the sky began to lighten. The murky light of dawn covered the road in front of my in-laws' house, with a cold color and a suffocating tension. I sat silently in the car, my hands clenched so tightly they were numb. Then another car pulled up behind us. The doors opened, and the sound of shoes on the asphalt was sharp and decisive. I looked through the glass and realized from that moment on that house that Amelia had always dressed with a facade of tradition and respect would no longer have anywhere to hide. The iron gate had barely opened when the agent's voice reading the warrant echoed. Each word was clear and cold like a hammer hitting stone. The atmosphere on the street changed instantly. Neighbors peeked through their doors. Some people on their way to the market stopped. In less than a minute, in front of my in-laws' house there was a crowd. No one spoke loudly, but the stares, the whispers, made everything even more tense. The first to come out was my mother-in-law. She was still wearing dark silk pajamas, her hair hastily tied up, but she tried to maintain a calm expression. She looked at the law enforcement in front of her and said in her usual tone of someone accustomed to giving orders and thinking she can cover up everything, "You have the wrong house." But as soon as she finished the sentence, her gaze passed over my Uncle Mike and fixed on me standing behind him. In an instant, I saw her face change completely. Her lips trembled, her eyes widened, and she froze like someone who has just fallen into an abyss. My father-in-law came out right after with the same cold face, the same posture of the master of the house. He stopped in the middle of the doorway, his voice hard and drawn out. "To do your job, you need evidence." The lead agent didn't raise his voice, but his reply was concise and enough to silence the entire yard. "We are here because we have evidence." Hearing that, I saw Mr. Arthur's shoulders stiffen. It was a minimal movement, but enough for me to know that this man was starting to feel fear. The door to the house was opened, and the agents entered fast and efficient without an extra move. I stood in the yard watching the scene, my heart beating so hard it hurt. Everything happened faster than I had imagined. In a few minutes, the back area of the house where the storage shed I had glimpsed through the door crack was located, was inspected. Boxes were dragged out, packages opened, shelves of documents turned over. And then what they had hidden for so long began to be revealed for all to see. Dozens of boxes of unlabeled products, fake labels stacked up, the double entry ledgers, the invoices with differing quantities, the distribution documents stored in a safe. With each discovery, my mother-in-law's face grew paler. Sophie ran out of the house, her hair disheveled, her face white, but her mouth still held its usual arrogance. As soon as she saw me, she screamed as if she were crazy. "You're a destroyer. You've ruined my family." Her shrill voice echoed in the yard, filled with people ridiculous and frightening. I looked her straight in the eyes. I didn't need to shout back. I just replied with a cold, concise voice. "I didn't ruin anyone. You did it to yourselves." As soon as I finished the sentence, Sophie seemed to want to advance but was held back. Seeing her face distorted by panic, I realized that people only become more aggressive when they know they have no way out. While the yard was in chaos from the back of the storage shed, a loud noise was heard like someone banging on a door from the inside. An agent shouted, and several ran towards it. That inner storage room was locked. I stood, paralyzed, my heart in my throat. A few seconds later, the sound of the lock being broken echoed sharp and violent. The door burst open, and then I saw her. Maria was brought out. Her hair disheveled, her face gray, her wrists with red marks from being tied. Her body trembled uncontrollably as if she had spent a night in hell. At that moment, the crowd at the gate exclaimed in unison. It was no longer a one-sided accusation, no longer suspicion or denial. Maria was the living, clear, and painful proof of everything my husband's family had done. Seeing Maria, my mother-in-law seemed to faint. She staggered, clung to a chair on the porch, her lips trembling, babbling incoherent phrases. "I don't know anything. I don't know. It wasn't me." But the way she denied it so quickly, so desperately revealed more than anything else. Those who don't know are shocked. Those who know too much rush to clear their name. I looked up and saw Daniel paralyzed halfway up the first-floor stairs. From the beginning, he had barely said a word. He no longer had the cold, threatening voice, nor the calculating look of the previous days. He was just standing there looking at me. His gaze was a mixture of anger, fear, despair, and a sense of betrayal. But looking into his eyes, I no longer felt pain. The one who betrayed first wasn't me. The one who tried to throw me into the abyss also wasn't me. When everything was basically inspected, the arrests began. My father-in-law, even with his hands cuffed, still turned. His face hard, his eyes glaring at me with hatred, he growled between his teeth. "You think you've won." The sentence was bitter and resentful, as if even at that moment he still wanted to use guilt to crush me. But I was no longer the daughter-in-law who lowered her head in the kitchen. I looked him straight in the eyes, my voice strangely calm. "No. I just didn't lose." He stopped for an instant. Perhaps it was the first time he realized I was no longer afraid of that family. I was no longer afraid of what they said, what they did, and much less of the facade of decency they used to oppress others for so many years. The 2 cars left as the sun had already risen. The sound of the engines in the narrow alley was heavy, as if dragging with it a mask that had just been torn off. The neighbors lined both sides of the street, some staring, others whispering. The family that had always claimed to be so respectable, that had always spoken of morals, that had always taught others to know their place, ended up being taken away under the curious gaze of everyone. I stood at the door for a long time. The morning wind on my shoulders was cold, but my mind was clearer than ever. Maria had been taken for medical care. The merchandise and documents had been sealed. Those who had forced me to be a maid, who had planned to turn me into a scapegoat, could no longer maintain their appearance of dignity. Everything seemed to have come to an end. But deep down, I knew this was only half the story, because in that house there was still someone who hadn't completely fallen. And that person was the link that gave me the most chills when I thought about him. As soon as the 2 cars disappeared around the corner, the yard in front of my in-laws' house began to empty. The neighbors dispersed, but the curious stares and whispers still hung in the air. I stayed a little longer and then left with Uncle Mike. During the ride back, I hardly spoke. In my head, the image of Maria with her marked wrists, Amelia's pale face, Mr. Arthur's hateful rigidity, and especially Daniel's gaze as he stood on the stairs looking at me, kept replaying. A look that didn't leave me in peace, not because I still felt something for him, but because I felt the story hadn't ended there. That afternoon, Uncle Mike called me. His expression was very serious. As soon as I sat down, I asked him, "Is there something else?" "Uncle," he didn't answer immediately. He gave me a glass of water, and then said slowly, "In the first deposition, Daniel wasn't detained. There isn't enough direct evidence to hold him at the moment." Hearing that I was silent for a few seconds, for some reason a brief, faint thought arose. Maybe he wasn't as involved as I thought. Maybe from the beginning he was just a weak person dragged along by his family, and not the mastermind behind it all. But that thought barely had time to form when Uncle Mike pushed a printed sheet towards me, pointed to a line in the middle of the page, his voice dry and cold. "In the data seized from the house, there's an electronic contract. The original file keeps a trace of who drafted it, edited it, and sent it last. The account that did it is Daniel's." I stared at the paper, my eyes burning. The information clearly showed the account name, the access time, the action of sending the file. It was no longer vague, no longer a feeling or a suspicion. It was there in black and white, so clear that I could no longer deceive myself. I looked up at my uncle, my voice hoarse, so he wasn't on the sidelines. Uncle Mike leaned back in his chair and sighed heavily. "He's not stupid. He doesn't expose himself like his parents. He stays in the middle, coordinating, connecting the dots, but he always maintains a position that seems to have no direct responsibility. That type of person is the most dangerous. He lets others do the dirty work while he maintains a clean appearance." His sentence sent a chill down my spine. After all, the person I trusted the most, who always placed himself in the middle to appease, to soften, to say things that seemed harmless, was in fact the most calculating. I sat there with the printout of the electronic contract in front of me, and in my head old memories surfaced clear and painful. Daniel's evasive look whenever his mother said horrible things to me, the way he always chose his words carefully to put me in a position where I had to give in, the times he gently asked me to sign to keep the peace, saying that since we were family we shouldn't be so rigid. Mom speaks harshly, but it's for your own good. And that afternoon when he showed up at my mother's door without apologizing, without asking how, I was just coldly demanding that I delete the data. All those things at that moment were no longer loose fragments. They came together to form a very clear path, a path by which he tried step by step to lead me to take the blame. I laughed. But the laugh sounded as dry as paper being crumpled. Uncle Mike looked at me without interrupting. I said slowly, as if talking to myself, "From the beginning, they didn't choose me because I was compatible with Daniel. They chose me because I did exactly the job they needed." He nodded very slightly. That nod hurt more than any word of comfort. That night, the sky darkened quickly. The wind outside whistled through the dry flowers, making a disturbing sound. I sat alone in the living room. My mother had already gone to bed, but I couldn't sleep. At that moment, the doorbell rang. I went to open the door and wasn't surprised to see Daniel, but he was different from the other times. He no longer had the expression of anger, nor the cold gaze, nor the threatening voice. He stood there visibly thinner in just one day, with deep dark circles under his eyes. The collar of his shirt was wrinkled. It took him a moment to speak, his voice very low, almost inaudible. I didn't think things would get to this point. I stood on the porch looking at the man in front of me. If it had been a few days ago, maybe that sentence would have still hurt me. But at that moment, I only felt a cold lucidity. I looked at him for a long time and asked, "You didn't think, or you thought you would get away with it?" The question silenced him. He didn't refute, didn't deny, didn't justify himself, just lowered his head for a few brief seconds. And that was enough. I went down one step, getting closer to him. The distance between us was short, but I felt it was greater than ever. I said slowly, each word clear and firm. "From the beginning you chose their side. I chose the right side." Daniel pressed his lips together, his hand clenching at his side. Maybe he wanted to say something, to cling to something, or to continue playing the role of the husband caught between two fires. But it was too late. After everything I knew, I could no longer believe a single word that came out of his mouth. He stood there for a few more seconds and then turned his back crossing the gate where I had entered with a wedding dress and a too simple trust. I watched him walk away, and strangely I no longer felt the pain of a betrayed woman, nor the tightness of nostalgia, nor the anger burning like fire. Instead, I felt a very sober clarity. This marriage was never a simple mistake. It was a carefully set trap, with sweet words, with a facade of decency, with the perfect performances of an entire family. And the only thing I felt lucky for was having managed to get out of that trap before being buried with it. After that night, when Daniel appeared at my mother's door and left in silence, I thought my heart was already cold enough not to be shaken by anything else from that family. But when I received the summons to give a statement as a provider of evidence, I realized there are things that, even when prepared, are not easy to face head-on. Because from that moment everything ceased to be suspicions, loose pieces, or accusations. It entered another dimension where every word, every look, every piece of evidence could strip away the true nature of an entire family. The interrogation room that day was colder than I expected, not because of the air conditioning, but because of the dense atmosphere. I sat on one side with the case file in front of me, an agent taking notes beside me, and on the other side, Amelia, Mr. Arthur, and Sophie. In such a short time since the search, their faces were already different. My mother-in-law no longer had her arrogance, but her eyes still shone with malice. My father-in-law maintained a straight posture, his chin slightly raised as if trying to hold on to a last shred of dignity. Sophie was restless, biting her lip and looking from side to side, her usual arrogance already revealing impatience and fear. As soon as she saw me enter, Amelia growled, almost forgetting where she was. "You still have the nerve to show up here. If it had been a few days ago, maybe that sentence would have made me swallow hard. But that day I just sat down, looked at her directly and replied concisely, 'I came as the person you tried to pin the blame on.'" The room fell silent for a moment. She paused for a few seconds, as if not expecting me to dare to say that they're in front of an investigator. And I, upon saying those words, felt a weight lift from me, because finally what they had tried to cover up with the family name had been called by its true name. The investigator began the questioning without beating around the bush. The folders were opened. Each photograph, each video, each data file was reviewed in order. They talked about the warehouse, the packages with swapped labels, the double-entry bookkeeping, the contracts with the legal liability section left blank. Every detail was clear, cold, and left no room for excuses. However, Mr. Arthur remained firm. He listened to everything in silence, and then said with a dry voice, "Without a signature, you can't prove anything." That kind of denial made me realize that even now he still hoped to escape through legal technicalities. I didn't wait to be asked anything else. I sat up straight in my chair, my voice calm. They tried to force me to sign several times. "I have recordings." With that, I handed over the audio files. One of the recordings was played in the room. Amelia's unmistakable voice echoed, "Just sign it. If there's any problem, the family will handle it." Just that sentence made the atmosphere heavy. I looked at my mother-in-law and saw her face turn visibly pale. People can deny with their eyes, with their attitude, with manipulative words, but their own voice echoing in an interrogation room is undeniable. Sophie was the first to break. She turned to me, her face red, her lips trembling, and exploded with her usual shrill tone. "You're ungrateful. My family took you in, gave you a decent wedding, and now you come and bite the hand that fed you." Her voice was so sharp that the investigator had to bang on the table, his voice serious and cold. "This is not a place for arguments. If you want to say something, stick to the facts." Interrupted, Sophie fell silent, but her eyes still burned with anger, as if she wanted to tear me apart. At that moment, the door opened, and another agent brought in Maria. I knew she would appear, but seeing her enter that room, I felt a lump in my chest. She no longer walked with her head down, hunched over like in that house. Her face was still thin and pale, but her gaze was different. Tired but direct. Pained but unyielding. She sat down, placed her hands on her knees, and said each word clear. I recorded all their activities for 8 months. As soon as she finished the sentence, Amelia jumped up like a compressed spring suddenly released. She pointed at Maria, her voice failing with rage and panic. "You wretched woman, you betrayed me," but Maria didn't lower her head. She looked her straight in the eyes, her voice not loud but so firm it was chilling. "I didn't betray anyone. I just didn't want anyone else to die because of what you sell." The room seemed to run out of air at that moment. I heard the creak of a chair, the sound of a pen dropping, and then a heavy silence descended on everyone. Demal, that word froze me. Before in my head, this was a network of counterfeit low-quality products, a matter of money, of deceit, of shifting blame. But when Maria spoke of death, everything changed. It was no longer a simple, dirty business. It had touched on real consequences, real lives, the real pain of people out there. An investigator turned to me, his voice not aggressive but direct. "Ma'am, did you know that this product had already caused serious consequences?" I shook my head, my throat dry, my hands clenched so tightly they were cold. In my head, there was only one thought times I almost signed those papers. Asterisk, I almost became the responsible person, the person who would be called to answer if everything came to light. If I had given in a little more, if I had closed my eyes one more time, or if in the name of family I had signed without thinking, maybe today, the one sitting on the other side wouldn't be Amelia but me. The session ended with the seizure of all documents, the depositions to be supplemented, and the investigation to be expanded to an even greater level of gravity. I left that room with my feet, feeling like lead. Everything seemed to be clear, but deep down I felt it wasn't over yet, because among all the names revealed between the denials and the increasingly overwhelming evidence, there was still a crucial point to be unraveled. And I knew very well who held that point. Daniel. Leaving the interrogation room that day, I didn't go home. I stayed in the hallway for a long time, leaning against the cold wall, my head buzzing with Maria's words. "I just didn't want anyone else to die because of what you sell." That sentence alone was enough to change the color of the whole story in my eyes. It was no longer the tragedy of a deceptive marriage, nor the drama of a mother-in-law and daughter-in-law, nor the story of a family setting a trap for the daughter-in-law to escape justice. Behind it all, there was something darker, dirtier, and that had probably been going on for longer than I had imagined. I was about to go down the stairs when I heard a low voice calling me from behind. "Eleanor." I turned. It was Maria. But it was the first time she had called me by my name. It was no longer Miss, nor the submissive voice of a housekeeper used to lowering her head. Her posture was also different, still thin, still pale after days of captivity and interrogation, but her gaze was no longer evasive. I looked at her for a few seconds and asked softly, "Do you want to talk to me?" She nodded. "If you still want to know the whole truth." We sat in a quiet corner of the hallway where the afternoon light entered obliquely through the window, forming a stripe on the floor. She was silent for a long time, as if organizing the memories in her head. Then she spoke, her voice low and steady. "I'm not the housekeeper you think I am." I looked at her without interrupting. She continued. "A few years ago, I worked for another distributor. It wasn't big, but it was serious. Once a batch of nutritional products we delivered had complaints. At first, they thought it was a storage problem. Then it was discovered that they were counterfeit products with swapped labels and origins. I felt my hands turn cold." Maria continued, speaking slowly, as if each sentence had to pass through a layer of pain to come out. She told me that at that time several children were hospitalized for poisoning. One of them did not survive. The case was covered up very quickly. The documents were altered. The responsibility for the origin of the products was diluted among several intermediaries. To an outsider, it seemed like just a quality scandal, but for someone who worked in the warehouse like her, she knew there was a hand behind it all. I followed the trail of the lot code, the transport route, and that's when the name of your host family's company started to appear, she said. I was silent. Each of her words fell like a heavy stone. Until now, I knew my husband's family had fraudulent businesses, but I never imagined that the price of that fraud was a life. She looked up at me and continued. After that, I got in touch with some people who were discreetly investigating this network. They weren't relatives of the victims nor journalists. They were people who gathered information, who followed leads, but at the time they lacked direct evidence to catch your in-laws. They lacked access to the warehouse, to the original documents, to someone inside the house. I asked softly, "So that's why you went to work there?" She nodded. I agreed to work there for almost a year. At first, I thought I'd stay only a few months, gather what I needed, and leave. But they were more careful than I thought. Everything locked, everything with several layers of security. They didn't trust strangers, but they liked to use longtime employees, turning them into shadows. I lived there lowering my head, pretending to be a countrywoman with little education, who only knew how to be afraid. The more ignorant they thought I was, the more careless they became. I took a deep breath slowly. So many times I had seen her being scolded, receiving orders, being dragged to the storage shed. I felt sorry for her, as if she were a housekeeper in trouble. Only at that moment did I realize that behind her submission was a long period of calculated suffering to survive, and to wait for the day she would gather enough evidence. I asked softly, "And the USB drive?" She answered immediately. "I had already prepared it. It wasn't the only one, but the one I gave you was the most complete I could get my hands on at that moment." At this point, she looked at me deeply and smiled sadly. "I just didn't expect you to be the one to speed everything up." I was confused. "Me? How so?" She was silent for a few seconds, and then said a sentence that chilled me to the bone. "At first, they didn't see you as a scapegoat. They just saw you as a daughter-in-law with an education. Marrying you was good for the image, for the facade they needed. But after they learned you worked in the legal field, that you were used to dealing with contracts and detecting flaws in documents, they changed their plan." I clenched my hands tightly. She continued, her voice slow but firm. "You became the perfect piece. A newcomer, with a clean record, with knowledge in the area, and on top of that, family. All they needed was for you to sign in the right place, and all the legal responsibility would be easily transferred to you." I felt a lump in my throat. So I wasn't just tricked into a marriage. I was chosen. Chosen. For my profession, for my social role, for my appearance decent enough to serve as a front. I was paralyzed for a few seconds, and then asked the question that had been haunting me since I left the interrogation room. And Daniel Maria didn't answer immediately. She turned her face to the window, her gaze tired, then said in an even lower voice, "He wasn't dragged into this. He's the one who knows best how to get around the law." I looked at her without blinking. She continued, "His parents are greedy. But it's the greed of those used to oppressing others. Daniel is different. He knows how to use the system, knows how to leave an escape route, knows not to sign directly where it's dangerous, knows who to put in front and who to keep behind. There are files, there are methods that only someone who understands laws can set up that way." Each of her words was like pulling back the final curtain. The man who had been so gentle with me, who had said he didn't need a wife, who was an expert in the kitchen, who placed himself in the middle of every conflict as if he were helpless, was after all the most lucid, the coldest, and the most dangerous of them all. Maria looked at me, her voice softening a little. "You were lucky to escape, Eleanor. Many people don't get the same opportunity. There are those who know, but can't get out in time. There are those who can't leave because they've already signed. There are those who, when they realize, already have their name on all the papers." I heard that and felt a shiver. I remembered every contract with blank spaces every time my father-in-law gave me a folder, every time my mother-in-law rushed me to sign. Every time Daniel said softly, "We're family, don't be so rigid," everything ceased to be loose details. It was a machine prepared to swallow a person and crush them. When I stood up to leave, my steps were as heavy as lead. The hallway was the same, the afternoon light still pale on the floor. But I was already different. I knew very well what I had escaped from. It wasn't just a fake family, a trap of a marriage. I had escaped from a whole system set up in advance, cold, calculating, and patient enough to wait for someone like me to step into the exact place they needed. After the conversation with Maria, I thought I was prepared to face the truth about Daniel. I told myself several times that this man was no longer my husband, that what remained between us was just a link to be unraveled in this case. But when I received the notification that Daniel had been summoned for a second time now as a direct party involved, my heart grew heavy in a way that's hard to describe. Perhaps because even having seen his true face through documents, data, and Maria's words somewhere in a corner, I still needed to hear it from his own mouth. Not to forgive, but to finally bury the last remnant of naivety in me. That day, I was called for a confrontation. The room wasn't large. The white light illuminated everything coldly and sharply. I sat down, my hands on my knees, trying to keep my breathing regular. Shortly after, Daniel was brought in. Unlike the time he was at my mother's door, or when he stood paralyzed on the stairs watching the police today, he didn't look away. His face was visibly thinner, the dark circles deep, but his gaze still had a disturbing calm, as if he were still trying to maintain some control. He looked at me for a few seconds and asked directly, without beating around the bush, without feigning remorse. "What do you want?" I raised my head, looked him in the eyes. I thought I would tremble or choke, but I didn't. My voice, when it came out, was so cold and flat that even I was surprised by it. The truth. As soon as I finished the sentence, the investigator on the other side opened the folder that was already prepared. Each document was taken out and placed neatly on the table. The electronic contract, the system access log, the file, edit history, the record of the last time it was sent. Everything pointed to the same account, the same name, the same person. There was no more room for ambiguity, for excuses like I didn't know I was just following orders. I was caught between my family and you, as he used to portray. Daniel looked at the pile of papers for a long time. I noticed his finger tapping lightly on the edge of the table, 2 small taps, the same habit he had whenever he was considering which phrase would cause him the least damage. Then he raised his head, still trying to maintain his firm voice. "I was just following orders." Hearing that, I laughed. Not a long laugh, but a short, dry, cold sound. I looked at him and said slowly, "You always knew how to stay behind, so no one would catch you." Daniel turned to me, his gaze darkening for an instant, but he continued to hold himself straight, trying to preserve his usual calm. The investigator didn't let the silence drag on. He pushed another pile of documents towards him, his voice firm and concise. "Who designed this process?" The room fell into absolute silence. The air became thick. I heard the sound of the fan on the ceiling. Daniel didn't answer immediately. He looked at the table, then at the window, and finally back at the folder. It was only a few seconds, but it seemed like an eternity. Then he said just 2 words, not loudly, not with anger, not denying, but it was enough to paralyze the room. I did. I don't know how long I held my breath. There are truths that, even if we already suspect them when we hear them from the person's own mouth, are like a knife to the chest. In the next room, where my mother-in-law was waiting to give further statements, Amelia's desperate scream was heard. "What are you saying?" Her voice was so shrill it echoed down the hallway. But it was too late. The words had been spoken, and this time the one who said them wasn't me, nor Maria, nor a police officer. It was Daniel himself. He turned to me, his voice deeper now, without the initial indifference. "I didn't think you'd go this far." The sentence made my heart tighten for an instant, but not with pain. It was because I finally heard what I needed to hear. I looked at him directly and answered coldly. "Because you thought I was going to sign." This time, Daniel didn't deny it. He smirked, a thin, tired, bitter smile. Then he said very slowly, as if he no longer needed to hide, "If you had signed, everything would have gone smoothly. I had it all planned." I was silent. No sound in the room interrupted that moment. That sentence was clearer than any evidence, more venomous than any insult from my mother-in-law, colder than the folders of documents in front of me, because it confirmed the most repugnant thing from the beginning: I was never seen as a woman. I was just a plan. I didn't cry, nor did I scream, as one might expect. After everything I had been through, I just felt my body cool down rapidly, as if a bucket of ice water had been poured over me. I looked at Daniel and asked the last question. The question that since the day I left their house I never stopped wanting to know. And me, in that plan, what was I? Daniel didn't look away, didn't think, didn't hesitate for a second. He answered immediately, concisely, and so cruelly that upon hearing it I felt my ears ringing. "You were the one responsible." I stood motionless. The answer was short, but it was enough to kill the last ember of what was once called the love of a husband and wife. After all the dinners, all the kind words, all the held hands, all the looks that seemed sincere, even if they had a drop of truth, they weren't as true as the naked, raw reality in front of me. The man I trusted the most, who I thought would be my pillar, was after all the most calculating, the one who clearly planned to make me his sacrifice. I stood up, very slowly. The chair scraped back, making a small noise in the silence of the room. I said nothing more. There was nothing more to say. There are moments when words are superfluous because the truth is sharp enough to cut through everything. I just nodded my head, not to Daniel, but to myself, as if confirming that from that moment everything was truly over. Then I turned and left without looking back. I didn't need to look one more time because I knew that with that answer alone my marriage was buried. Not with a piece of paper, not in a court, but with the cold confession of the man who once called me his wife. After that confrontation I went home in a very strange state. It was no longer the overwhelming shock of the first few days, nor the confusion of so many loose pieces. Now everything was too clear, so clear that there was no more room for excuses. and that was why the silence after the storm was so frightening. It was like being in the middle of a field after a big thunderstorm, seeing the fallen trees everywhere and realizing that from then on no one could pretend that everything was normal. The case expanded rapidly. What started as being about a warehouse, documents and products with swapped labels, led the authorities to discover a series of other connections. It wasn't just counterfeiting but also tax evasion, legalization of certificates, movement of goods through various intermediaries to erase the trail and hide the true origin. The deeper they dug, the more I shuddered, realizing that my husband's family wasn't improvising. They had turned fraud into a business model. On the outside, a family of respectable entrepreneurs. On the inside, a meticulously calculated machine from the documents and warehouses to the person who would take responsibility. And then, the first formal charges were announced. Amelia and Mr. Arthur were identified as the ringleaders of the network. Sophie was investigated as an accomplice for her involvement in transactions, transportation of goods, and concealment of information. And Daniel, after everything that was revealed by the electronic data, the depositions, and the way the process was set up, finally had no way to escape. The man who had presented himself to me with a polite air, who spoke with moderation, was after all the architect of the entire system, with a cold mind and a frightening calm. The news spread faster than I thought, perhaps because of the gravity of the case, or perhaps because that family's facade was so well built that when it broke it generated even more talk. The people who had bought the products, who had been affected, who suspected but dared not speak up, began to come forward. Some called the police, others sent medical reports, others brought old invoices, empty packages, and even photographs of their children in the hospital. I looked at that information and clenched my hands so tightly that my fingers went numb. It was no longer out of fear, but because of a thought that pierced my mind like a cold needle. If on that day I had given in, if I had signed those papers, it would most likely be me facing all these accusations. One morning, when I was called to provide some more information, I happened to see my mother-in-law being taken to a car. She no longer had the elegant or arrogant air of before. Her hair was disheveled, her face gaunt, her eyes still sharp, but it was the look of someone who knows they have nothing left to hold on to. As she passed me, she stopped for an instant, turned her head, and stared at me. In her gaze there was hatred, bitterness, and a distorted helplessness. Then she hissed between her teeth, her voice hoarse. "You destroyed everything." I stared at the woman who had shoved an apron into my chest, who had tried to turn me into a maid and then a scapegoat for her entire family. I don't know why, but at that moment I felt very calm, without anger, without satisfaction, without feeling the need to say much. I just replied very softly, but each word was clear. "No. You did." Amelia stopped. Perhaps it was the first time in her life she was left speechless to dominate someone. Because there are truths that once exposed cannot be covered up with a loud voice or the habit of oppressing. Maria was later placed under witness protection. What she secretly collected for almost a year became the most important evidence. I often thought of her and felt a lump in my throat. A thin, quiet woman, always with her head down like a shadow in that house, ended up being the key piece to tear away the veil of falsehood. Life is sometimes strange. The loudest is not always the strongest. The most despised can be the one who holds in their hands what makes everyone tremble. Uncle Mike also changed a lot after this. He remained a man of few words, saying only what was necessary, but I knew he cared for me in his own way. Once leaving the station, he walked slowly beside me, looked ahead, and said in his deep voice, "You did the right thing. But the price of doing the right thing is never light." I heard him and nodded. I understood that sentence better than anyone. Doing the right thing doesn't mean we don't feel pain. Choosing the right side doesn't mean everything will be easy. It just means that later, when we look in the mirror, we can still face ourselves. A few days later, I officially filed for divorce. No tears, no scene of tearing up the papers, and then picking them up like in the stories people tell. I sat at the table, read each line, filled in each field, not out of nostalgia, but because I remembered the times my husband's family gave me papers to sign with the same soft voice, with the same appearance of being something unimportant. But with one difference: in those times, they wanted me to sign to bind my life to their mistakes. This time, I signed to free myself from that trap. After signing, I looked at my name on the paper for a long time. I felt a relief. This marriage, in truth, never began as it should have. It was built on calculation, concealment, the perfect performances of a family used to using a facade of decency to deceive others. So when it ended, I didn't feel like I lost a home. I just felt that I had finally closed the wrong door. Everything gradually calmed down, at least on the surface. The case continued. The involved parties continued to be investigated. My life slowly returned to normal, but the echo remained not only in me but certainly in many people who followed this story. Because by going through this, I realized that it's not just about the tragedy of a newly married woman deceived by her husband's family. It's a very real warning for anyone who trusts appearances too much, for anyone who easily gives in to pretty words or underestimates the warning signs from the beginning. There are traps that are not made of barbed wire or locks. They are made of a false kindness of a smile at the right moment of the word family said with sweetness. And if on that day I hadn't had the lucidity to back away in time, maybe today the one paying the price wouldn't just be their family but also me. After all, the turmoil life slowly returned to its normal rhythm. Not a normality that makes you forget everything, nor one where all the wounds disappear. Just that with each passing day I learned to wake up without being startled by a call from an unknown number, to go to work without looking over my shoulder to see if someone was setting another trap for me to have dinner with my mother on. A quiet night without my heart feeling as heavy as a stone. I returned to work after a short leave. My desk was the same. The pile of cases was the same. The water glass in the corner was the same one I used before. At first glance, nothing had changed, but only I knew that I was different. Not stronger in the sense of being tough, nor so resilient that I no longer felt pain. Just that, after going through such a dark period, a person learns to value peace, more genuine things, and to be more attentive to everything that seems too perfect. Many people asked me if I regretted it. Some directly, others more subtly, others just with a hesitant look as if they wanted to know if I still missed that marriage. Each time I smiled and answered simply, if I hadn't left, then I would have regretted it. I didn't say it to seem strong. It was the truth. Because there are doors that only after leaving do you realize how suffocating the environment inside was. There are people that only after moving away from do you understand that staying was the greatest danger. In the beginning, whenever I remembered, I still felt pain. Not because I still loved him, but because one day I had believed. People think that betrayal only causes anger, but there are much more subtle types of betrayal. They sadden us for having given our sincerity in the wrong place. They humiliate us for discovering that what we thought was a safe harbor was after all part of a trap. But fortunately for me, that pain did not turn into resentment. It calmed down, becoming a memory deep enough to keep me alert, but no longer sharp enough to hurt me every day. One night, while my mother and I were preparing vegetables on the porch, she asked very softly, "Does it still hurt, honey?" After asking, she lowered her head as if afraid that by looking at me she would see me falter. I was silent for a moment and then I smiled. A smile, neither happy nor sad, just sincere. I answered, "Of course it does, Mom." But it didn't break me. My mother said nothing more, just nodded. That night darkened quickly. The wind blew through the flowers in the yard with a soft sound. And I felt a strange warmth in my heart. Maybe because I finally didn't have to pretend that everything was fine. I felt pain, but I wasn't trapped by it. Maria's USB drive. I still have it. Not in a hidden place, but not mixed with other things either. It's in a small drawer, silent, but every time I see it I remember a phase of my life that I went through with lucidity and luck. I keep it not to cling to the past, nor to feed bitterness against those who wronged me. I keep it as a reminder that sometimes a single decision can change our destiny. And on that day, in the midst of all the confusion and pain, I did not choose to lower my head. Maria eventually left. She didn't stay in the city for long, nor did she want to continue being associated with the case. Before leaving, she came to my house once. She wore a simple dark blouse, her hair tied back, her face still thin, but her gaze much lighter. We were together for a short time without needing many words. Before she stood up, she looked at me and said something I'll never forget. "You didn't just save yourself. You saved people you don't even know." I heard that and felt a lump in my throat. Because it's true, there are things we do at first just to save ourselves, but in the end, we realize their impact was much greater. One day after almost all the procedures were finished, I passed by the old street and stopped in front of that family's house one more time. The gate was there, the wall was there. The yard where so much happened was silent under the afternoon sun. The only difference was that there were no more screams, no more false hustle and bustle, no more moral lessons told to oppress others. The house seen from the outside seemed empty and cold, as if everything that made it seem welcoming and respectable was just a layer of paint covering a great void. I stared for a moment, and then turned my back. I didn't look back, not because I wanted to seem decisive, but because honestly there was nothing more to see. There are things that once understood in their essence do not change. No matter how much we look, there are places in front of which, if we continue to stand still, it's not because we still feel something, but because we don't forgive ourselves. I didn't want that. Now looking back, I don't feel like I lost a family. Saying that might sound lighter to many, but for me it's not the truth. I never truly had a family there to be able to lose it. What I avoided was a trap disguised as a family, a wrong life that if I had insisted on continuing I might have had to pay for with the rest of my peace and even with my honor and my future. Today I no longer feel anger when I remember. I only feel gratitude for the person I was on that day, for having had the lucidity to pick up my suitcase and leave the firmness not to sign what went against my conscience, and the determination not to go back just because of the word family. In life, no one can guarantee that they won't make a mistake on the path. Neither can I. I was wrong about people. I trusted in the wrong place. I gave my heart where I shouldn't have, but I think the most frightening thing is not making a mistake on the path. The most frightening thing is upon realizing the mistake. Forcing yourself to continue out of nostalgia, fear, or not having the courage to start over. And I managed to start over. Without fanfare, without ostentation, just living correctly in peace and in a way that every night before I sleep, I don't have to ask myself if on that day I had chosen differently, would I still be able to hold my head high today?